It's August, and you know what that means. It is time to talk about August anticipated releases, delayed like a week, at least on this channel because of the heat. And with that, we are at the fun kind of in-between stage within the publishing calendar of kind of the end of summer releases and beach reads moving into the fall publishing ramp up. Though the last couple of years, or honestly even the 5 I've been talking about books on booktube, it feels like we are getting a lot more of a really heavy year-long publishing calendar rather than seeing that real push in the fall. However, a lot of really big titles are still held for the fall spots, and we start to see that kind of bleed here. And as expected with that, August has a lot of really exciting releases to touch on. So hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. Ideally, every month we are previewing a lot of the books that I personally am excited about coming out in the month so that you can get things on your radar, get library holds in, get in a pre-order if you feel so led, or just generally get excited about some of these upcoming releases. And as always, I'm not going to be able to cover every release. So if there are books that I don't have on my radar or have not talked about here, feel free to share your excitement about upcoming releases below as well as sharing excitement for books we do talk about. And if all of that sounds up your alley, don't forget to like and subscribe as well. Now for August, a lot of the releases are really concentrated on the first and last release Tuesday of the month. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in to August 5th, which is a huge new release Tuesday. Starting off, we have the start of a new supernatural rom-com series from Olivia Dade with Zom Rom-Com, which actually kind of shocked me in the sense that we are getting the second in the Harlot's Bay series in November. So she is going to be having releases very close together with very different tonally seeming series, in the sense that this seems to be a supernatural rom-com following a zombie outbreak in a world where zombie outbreaks seem at least somewhat normalized, and our protagonist Edie hooks up or connects with her neighbor who turns out to be a vampire in order to fight back against the zombie apocalypse. This feels potentially tonally, though obviously more romance heavy, to last year's Dead Things Are Closer Than They Appear, the YA release that was a delight and a little bit of a surprise for me because I didn't know what to expect from the author, as well as we're seeing a shift kind of toward supernatural characters and plots similar to the 2000s and the kind of cyclical nature of what is popular. It's reminding me a little bit in some ways of something like Undead and Unwed by Mary Janice Davison that came out in the 2000s. So we had, you know, the more serious supernatural or urban fantasy series, even within romance, even though a lot of the more serious series still had a touch of humor, I would argue. And then we had some of the series that were much more kind of rom-com based. Even the Sookie Stackhouse books, to a certain extent, were much tonally different in some ways than True Blood. And while not maybe on the same level as something like Undead and Unwed, I would put them on a similar kind of par. And so I'm very interested to see this return tonally, and am interested to see what we get from Olivia Dade with it. And especially coming off of something like her Spoiler Alert series, where it feels very in conversation with fandom spaces, and things like supernatural themes very much lend themselves to fandom considerations. So I'll be very interested to see how it engages with that, if there are in references or kind of tongue-in-cheek references in this as well. I know that this has been a highly coveted title, at least from what I've seen on like threads, especially in comparison to something like her Harlot's Bay series, which I'm still very excited about and need to go back and read my copy of the first one. I did finally finish the Spoiler Alert trilogy, so I can now move on, but I'm very interested to see the start of this new series. Next for the 5th, we have Moderation by Elaine Castillo, which seems to sit in a similar kind of realm based on the blurb, I would say, to something like Ling Ling Huang. And this is following a content moderator who gets a job for the preeminent virtual reality content creation company, and her kind of being sucked in to this virtual reality, the opportunities it provides in real life for her, especially financially and for her family, but the way it kind of isolates her, as well as the relationship she starts to form with one of the founders of this company. And so it seems like it's really going to be exploring the blurred lines between reality and fantasy being the virtual realities that we have all built online to a large extent, even when it is ourselves we are presenting. And this idea of the liminal space of online is really intriguing to me. I have been long interested in the ways that we explore online in both fiction and on stage in theater, especially with the theatricality inherent or possible with that. And so I'm really interested to see how it's explored on the page here, because I do think it is a difficult thing to execute, but it is also an exploration that I think is so central to our lives as these spaces are bleeding together. And I think the cover really speaks to that bleeding of reality. And so very, very interested in this one. Next, we have a book I have had my eye on for most of the year, though I have not yet read. We have The Hounding by Zenobie Purvis. And what especially draws me to this is that it seems to be in the vein or the genre of blending the historical and the supernatural or the speculative, in that we are following a small community in the 18th century and members of the community and their suspicions around 5 sisters who they believe are turning into dogs. And so we obviously have these echoes of the witch hunts, especially with a blurb that bills it as The Crucible meets the Virgin Suicides, both at this point accepted canonical works about the tempestuousness of young adulthood for young women, written by men, may I add. So that is an interesting perspective to be bringing into the blurb from my point of view, though those are, of course, very recognizable titles. So I will be interested to see the perspective here, especially in relation to those explorations of power and young womanhood, especially within the historical setting and conceit of a very remote place where it's easy to feel isolated and constrained. And then narratively, I'm interested in the idea that we are getting this story from the villagers, and so like the gossip essentially, and what that is going to bring to the table narratively. So very, very intrigued by this one. Absolutely, and very excited to finally be able to dive in. Next, we have the continuation of a trend that I personally have been noticing the last couple of years, and I think I've seen some others commenting on as well, in that we are seeing very notable, recognized, celebrated young adult and middle grade authors make their adult debuts. And this next book is that, but potentially at a level even higher than last year's M.T. Anderson adult debut, I would potentially argue, and I was already very excited for that book, and also with a title and a conceit that is thematically and tonally, well, maybe not tonally, but different than what I have come to expect from this author in their middle grade fiction. We have the adult debut from Hole's author Louis Sachar, and if, like me, you were a fan of Sachar's work even pre-Hole's, which came out in 2000, with works like There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom, which I would notably say in second grade was my favorite book at the time, and of course, the Wayside School is Falling Down books. This feels potentially ripe for the same kind of comedic tone that I think readers have come to expect from Sachar, but it is a fantasy that I would not have expected from him, and something that I may have expected when I was a middle grade or young adult reader. And so it's notable to me that this is seemingly coming out, well, is coming out as an adult title when it's something that feels reminiscent kind of conceptually of something that we might see from like Gail Carlson Levine or contemporaries of that nature back in the 2000s and the late 90s, etc. And so this is following a princess who has been betrothed in an arranged marriage only to fall in love with a lowly scribe and the court magician that the king enlists to brew a potion to ensure that the wedding goes on as originally planned, and the kind of conflict within the court magician and the betrayal potentially of the princess in that choice. And so I'm very interested to see this from an adult framing. It does feel very in line with this trend toward cozy fantasy that we are seeing for adult titles. It does make me wonder or start to put pieces together in that, are we seeing this trend and this kind of thirst for these cozier fantasy titles in that they are comforting and familiar, in that they kind of harken back to some of this middle grade and young adult that we grew up in or on in terms of these fantasy themes and settings. So very, very interested because, like I said, I have not historically associated Lewis Sacker with that fantasy element that I grew up on. So I'm very interested to see his perspective, even as it already feels kind of familiar and comfortable and nostalgic in the framing of it. So very interested to see how the voice develops for adult audiences. If there is that familiarity in the voice, if done well, I could see it making me oddly emotional. So very, very interested in this one, and going to be very interested to see what the reception of this one is. Next, we have a new romantasy kind of dark fantasy gothic with House of the Beast by Michelle Wong, which is following the illegitimate daughter of one of the aristocratic families at the center of society in this book. But when her mother becomes gravely ill, she learns more about her estranged father, and in such makes a deal with the kind of god that rules her father's aristocratic family, as these aristocratic families have these connections to these gods. And in such, she makes a sacrifice in order to help save her mother. But when her mother does eventually pass, she is now connected and essentially trapped with her father's family, as well as connected to this god more than she ever anticipated. And the god potentially presents himself in different ways. And as this is from the illustrator of the Legend of Korra graphic novels, which I will admit I don't have any familiarity with, but there does seem to be illustrations peppered throughout this novel, which is also very exciting, especially from something with that gothic kind of tinge. I'm getting kind of echoes of maybe something like House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson in that kind of darkness, and so very interested to see what we are going to get here. An abrupt shift, though dark in a different way, we have Are You Mad at Me? How to Stop Focusing on What Others Think and Start Living for Yourself by Meg Josephson. Now, I have been on record very voraciously condemning is probably too strong word. I'm not a fan of self-help, but this book is from a psychotherapist, and it also says social media star. I am not familiar with this author's social media presence at all. I am simply drawn to the conceit of this book, which is talking about people-pleasing and anxiety presenting as people-pleasing behaviors, and the anxieties of thinking and always trying to position yourself around how you're being perceived by others in whatever way. This, to get vulnerable and honest for a second, is exploring a lot of how my own anxiety, when kind of at its worst, manifests. And so I'm very interested in this, and for tools to kind of help regulate it. I've, of course, been to therapy and have been given tools in those instances, but especially when considering it or thinking about how to navigate and manage, especially like in the workplace, like where it is beneficial and is able to help, anticipate problems down the line and solve needs for partners or coworkers, and where it is not helpful. And of course, there are layers to this, and these reactions and considerations are going to be more beneficial, as even the blurb points out, somewhere like the workplace than maybe in your friend group. But when anxiety is high, everything starts to kind of blend together. And so it honestly feels like a consolidation of where my anxiety was really manifesting at its worst when I went back to therapy a couple of years ago. And to be completely honest, a lot of that really was compounded by my job at the time, and I am in a much better place now, but I'm always eager to have more tools in the toolkit, knowing how my anxiety tends to present itself. And that is also part of my distinction with self-help, is that a lot of self-help for me I don't like, because it doesn't feel like it actually gives actionable steps or is actually saying anything of real substance. Rather, if you really look into it, a lot of it is kind of regurgitated empty platitudes without actionable items or things to consider. And so it feels like this kind of just snowball of sayings or quotes without any real substance behind it. And I believe there's a decent portion, not all by any means, of people writing in the genre that don't have any real expertise and also don't actually really have anything to say. But taking off my hater hat, I obviously am very hopeful that this is going to have something to say, have actionable advice, and seemingly is from an expert. Moving on, we have The Art of a Lie by Laura Shepard Robinson, which seems to be a historical kind of thriller mystery about a widow who owns a confectionery parlor who is seeing some difficulty in her business after the death of her husband. And additionally, it is appearing that there may be some more to her husband's death than first meets the eye, including potentially murder. And this is where her late husband's friend William Devereaux comes into play, in that he may be able to offer our protagonist Hannah some more insight into her husband, as well as teach her about ice cream that may save or help save her confectionery shop, potentially. However, what really draws me to this title, other than the potential for romance and kind of echoes of Amanda Quick romances I'm getting from the blurb, is that the main antagonist, as set out in the blurb, is Henry Fielding. Yes, author Henry Fielding, author of Tom Jones, Henry Fielding. And while I have not read Tom Jones since a summer in college, I am all too able and eager to visualize Henry Fielding as an author turned magistrate set out to make this protagonist's life more complicated and difficult. At the same time, the blurb does establish that as a magistrate, he seemingly is kind of hell-bent on confiscating money from their account that he believed was illicitly obtained. So it is going to be up to the book to kind of illuminate whether this is an earnest kind of belief, or if it's more twisted and if there's something more sinister or selfish going on. But again, it's been a long time since I touched any of Fielding's work, let alone read anything about him as a person, so I don't know that I'm coming to the table with anything that would lean me in either direction. But I'm tickled, probably more than I should be, at the idea of this classic author as the antagonist for this novel. Next we have Flash Out by Alexis Solosky, which seems to be a kind of dual timeline narrative flipping back and forth between 1972 and 1997. Both, as much as it upsets me, probably considered historical settings at this point, but it is following a young woman who in the 70s joins a theater troupe, and then in the more present timeline, kind of flashing back to the kind of repercussions of the time in the theater troupe and maybe some of the secrets that developed in relation to a mysterious letter showing up and what those secrets may have been. The end of the blurb with the line, "An immersive thriller exploring the enchantments and perils of art," is particularly of interest to me. I have a theater degree, and as such, I am all too willing to believe that there is a cult element to this novel. I think that especially within the time period that we're looking at, but also this idea of art and what art asks of us. There is, of course, a charismatic leader mentioned in the 70s portion of the blurb, but I even talked about this when talking about cultish at one point. This idea of kind of like in-group, and I think in theater in particular, there is this idea that you should do anything or be willing to do and sacrifice anything for the art, and that somehow makes you a better artist, when really it potentially just makes you more privileged or in a position where financially you can do that in some ways. Listen, there are larger conversations that I have alluded to, that I've dabbled in, and I'm very interested to see what this book has to say about that potential side of theater. And listen, I want to be clear that I'm not saying theater is a cult. However, I think that any time that you have something that is so driven by passion and vision and these kind of artistic circles, it is easier to, or it is easy, not necessarily easier, because people can be drawn into this kind of thinking anywhere, but it's easy to prey upon those passions in whatever way. And when you are looking at these smaller groups, it's an interesting exploration, and I am interested to see how this book explores it. Okay, next, and yes, we are still on the 5th. I told you it is one of the big release days of the month. We have Mad Sisters of Essie by Tashan Mehta, which feels kind of Piranesi in that it is following two sisters who are the keepers of the Whale of Babel, and how for one sister this is their world and their everything, but one sister dreams of more and leaves the whale. And with this, according to the blurb, she stumbles into a new universe where shape-shifting islands and ancient maps hold sway. And the blurb goes on to describe this as a blend of fables, dreams, and myths. So I'm very interested in the world it is going to create, the idea of this world within the whale, and whether the cosmic chambers, as alluded to in the blurb, are reminiscent of the kind of labyrinth of Piranesi, but also just the way this feels almost like a dream in its description. And I can almost imagine that kind of cinematic exploration of it that is kind of ethereal and a blend. Additionally, the cover of this is gorgeous. So I'm just very interested in how it's going to present itself, and surely it feels like it's going to be kind of very fairy tale-esque, kind of like a myth maybe, but also hard to kind of speculate on based on the blurb before I've even read it, and maybe will be hard to distill down after I do. Okay, next we have a nonfiction title that, as usual, I'm going to read off from the computer in front of me. We have Glitz, Glam, and a Damn Good Time, How Mamie Fish, Queen of the Gilded Age, Partied Her Way to Power by Jennifer Wright. I will admit, after I stumbled across this in the upcoming releases, I did giggle a little bit because I had just seen a parody video from Kyle Gordon, probably most notably known for Planet of the Bass, but he has a somewhat reoccurring series kind of poking fun at titles within different genres or age categories or subgenres, and I just happened to see his video about nonfiction prior to stumbling across this, where he made fun of the kind of trend of 3 things in a title that seemingly are kind of either unrelated or feel kind of mushed together in whatever way. It's a parody, obviously, so it's going to take it to the extreme, but also just the parallelism the threes make sense in titles and is catchy and pithy. I did kind of giggle, like I said, at Glitz, Glam, and a Damn Good Time, though. However, I am a sucker for explorations of the Gilded Age, especially something like this where we are seemingly going to be exploring the like over-the-top entertainments of the era, kind of blending the staid kind of perception that we have of the Gilded Age through things like Edith Wharton, but also like the political power that came with throwing parties. And it did make me think of one of the first Joanna Shoops that I read. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but I remember there being something about like a horse and a ballroom in it, and just kind of like this excess and this show of wealth, which is frankly more fun to read about historically, or in historical fiction especially, than to think about the concentration of wealth and the parallels to the Gilded Age in the modern moment without nearly the philanthropy that we saw in the Gilded Age, which I have talked about before. If you're gonna robber baron, the very least you could do is fund a public library for me and wear a monocle. Either way, this is going to be exploring one of the major Gilded Age tastemakers and hostesses and her unique brand of themed party, and how the innovations of the Gilded Age and industry at the time kind of helped make a lot of this possible, as well as the political power and the power inherent in being a hostess of this nature, and what it meant to be a woman and what power for a woman looked like at the time and in these social circles, admittedly, as well, though of course the connection to power is going to offer more power as well. And so there's a lot to consider, but I can almost guarantee that the exploration and themes of these parties, while still somewhat questionable, and I'm sure we will unpack a lot of the more complicated ideas around them, I bet they are a heck of a lot more entertaining and cohesive than certain weddings that were thrown recently. And then finally, for the 5th, we have Full Bloom by Francesca Saratella, which is following a young lighting designer, Iris, who is kind of reeling and at a kind of precipice in her life, as she has recently been overlooked at her job, and she is reeling from a recent breakup, and then she is gifted a bespoke perfume from a neighbor, and she quickly comes to realize that this perfume opens up a completely new world for her in terms of her desirability and her ability to obtain what she wants, especially in relationships, and leveraging that for power and whatnot. And this kind of puts her in a different circle and opens her up to seeing things about these circles and the world potentially. It does make me think in some ways of kind of like a modern take on similar explorations in the classic novel at this point, I would argue, Perfume. And so I'm very interested to see how it's going to explore the concept of scent in this novel and the kind of correlation between scent and power and what kind of lines it's drawing there. I'm hopeful it'll make some interesting choices. It's also interesting to think of the protagonist as a lighting designer in relation, because I read Perfume after college, but we watched the movie in college because we were talking in one of my design classes, like the basic design classes you had to take as a theater major, because I have no expertise or skill in design, but this idea of designing for scents you can't experience in the theater, specifically in relation to that movie for smell, because of course we have the idea of perfume, but also contrasted with the world that it exists around and in, if you have not read the book or seen the movie. And so I'm interested to see how this book will potentially play with invoking the senses, and also to see this thematic exploration from a contemporary novel where something like Perfume is from a historical perspective. And with that, we are finally moving on to August 12th. The first new release of the week is My Best Friend's Earl by Bethany Bennett, which is the second in the Blue Stocking Bookseller series, which I have not yet gotten to the first one of, but this is following eccentric bookseller Constance. We know she's eccentric in the blurb because it says that she walks her cat on a leash around Hyde Park. But she is enlisted by a friend to help her friend get out of an arranged marriage with an earl that is not a love match, and Constance is one that believes that marriage is for love and adventure. However, Vincent, the earl in question, is one that believes in marriage as a contract and is much more pragmatic about the whole thing, and while he recognizes that his potential bride-to-be is becoming somewhat reluctant, he's still determined to go through with this match, though he starts to become distracted by Constance, who throws a wrench in his well-ordered world, I am sure. Next we have For the Record by Emma Lord, which is a contemporary romance following a former punk rocker and pop princess who are thrown back together in an effort to kind of revitalize their careers, as there is a history there of both rivalry and potential flirtation, and how they find their ways back to each other in this next chapter of life and also revitalize their careers. The next book seems perfect for those of us who have been craving something to follow up Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil. With queer vampires and an undercurrent of tension and danger, we have The Midnight Shift by Qian Xianran and translated by Jean Ping. And apologies as my pronunciation lookups were not as fruitful this go around. But this is following a string of apparent suicides of 4 separate elderly patients at a hospital, and an investigation that leads our protagonist to someone assured that vampires are behind it. And then next we have Seduction Theory by Emily Adrian, which is seemingly about college professors and affairs, which at first glance is probably not something I'm going to gravitate to first. However, I am very interested in this in the kind of exploration of who gets to tell stories, as this is following 2 professors, and one has a more prestigious career, it appears, and her husband has an affair, and they're seemingly working through this, but Simone, the wife in this couple, gets very close with a graduate student. They become running partners and confidants in some ways, and that trust is then shaken when the graduate student fictionalizes Simone's relationship and relationship struggles and troubles for their MFA thesis. And so I'm very interested in this idea of who gets to tell stories and certain stories, and how the teller of stories also twists the truth of those stories, and whether an outside perspective is the most truthful perspective, and also how outside that perspective really is, as well as kind of the exploration of the messiness, especially of these relationships in academic circles, which I think are often complicated and messy, and there are, of course, a lot of ethical quandaries and questions and explorations in that as well. So I am going to be very interested to see what the response to this is coming out, because it could be, and this is not me speaking down in any way, it could be a very trite kind of exploration, or it could be something very illuminating, and we will see which it is, I guess. Moving on to August 19th, we have one of my most anticipated books of the month and one of my pre-orders, an author that has become basically an auto-buy for me at this point. We have The Possession of Alba Diaz by Isabel Cañas, which is her newest gothic horror romance, which I am very excited for. I love her unique blend of the gothic and the historical and the supernatural with romance and all of these undertones combined, the danger as well as the unique historical settings she is bringing to the table, and this is no different. Here we're set in 1765 Mexico, where our protagonist Alba is fleeing plague and goes with her parents and her fiance to silver mines in Mexico. But there is seemingly more than meets the eye to these silver mines, as Alba starts having hallucinations and visions and is plagued by something. Meanwhile, Elias, the cousin of her betrothed, is running from his own past and is trying to keep to himself, but he notices that there is something going on with Alba and there is a growing tension between them. I will admit, I don't know that I have read a possession story myself, so I'm very excited for this. I'm really interested to see how Cañas' voice continues to develop with this. While I enjoyed The Hacienda, I thought Vampires of El Norte really continued to develop her voice in interesting ways, and I really, really loved that book. But this book feels like it's going to be a kind of thematic mixture in some ways of both The Hacienda and Mexican Gothic, and I'm very, very interested in that and to see where this book lands us. Like I said, I really enjoy the settings of Cañas' books. I love the atmosphere and tone that she creates so far with the two novels that she's given us, and I of course love the way that romance is woven throughout that, and am very, very excited to see how she continues to build upon her body of work here. Next we have Ruth by Kate Riley, which is seemingly going to be exploring a woman's life within a Christian cult. I find it interesting because it's tagged with cult classics on Goodreads, but I think it's literally just about a cult. However, I think that this is going to be a very timely exploration, especially as we are seeing the rise of this kind of trad wife rhetoric and aesthetic, and remembering what it is invoking and what it is leaving out about the past. And yeah, I will be interested to see what this has to say. Next we have Lessons in Magic and Disaster by Charlie Jane Anders, which seems to be about an academic and witch, her shut-in mother, and a 300-year-old magical book and the secrets therein. I'm very interested to the kind of New England magical roots of this, especially the book from 1749 that seems to be a pivotal kind of hinge of the story. I will say I think Charlie Jane Anders is most known for All the Birds in the Sky, which I read when it came out, and I was really conflicted on that book. I couldn't tell you anything about it today, and there were times where I felt like the narrative really kept me at a distance, and it was one of those narratives that I talk about where everything feels kind of fuzzy, and it was frustrating in the reading of that often for me, honestly, but I still recognize the promise of this author's voice, and so I'm very interested to see it in something like this, which feels like a very comfortable kind of wheelhouse narratively for me in terms of explorations of magic and witchcraft and history and secrets. So yeah, we'll see. And then next we have Hemlock and Silver by T. Kingfisher, the newest fairy tale retelling, and I am very excited to finally dive in to the copy I won in a Goodreads giveaway that I have been holding closer to release to talk about, because ideally we will be talking about this in a future Friday. This is a Snow White retelling, and seemingly based on the blurb, a more unconventional Snow White retelling, in that it is following healer, or a healer, Anja, who regularly drinks poison to kind of build up her tolerance, and she is summoned by the king to help his daughter Snow, who is slowly dying of poison. And then in the last part of the blurb it says, aided by a taciturn guard, a narcissistic cat, and a passion for the scientific method, Anja rushes to treat Snow, but nothing seems to work. That is, until she finds a secret world hidden inside a magic mirror. This dark realm may hold the key to what is making Snow sick, or it may be the thing that kills them all. And so I'm interested in the idea that there is potentially not an evil queen in this retelling, and I still need to read A Sorceress Comes to Call, which was, I believe, the last fairy tale retelling published by T. Kingfisher, but very excited about this. I'm not someone who generally, I feel like, gravitates to Snow White retellings, but I'm very interested in this. Obviously, I really have enjoyed the T. Kingfisher I've read historically. I like the blend of danger and magic and humor that I've read in her work before, and I'm very interested in this idea of the world on the other side of the mirror in this book, as well as this taciturn guard. There's a lot of promise in a taciturn guard, so we will have to see together. And finally, we are at August 26th, which is the last new release Tuesday of the month, and as previously established, also one of the heftier new release Tuesdays of the month, so I'm going to probably try to go a little quicker through this back half than I did the front half, so apologies if I don't get as in-depth, but also you're welcome for not going on as many tangents, maybe. And first, unsurprisingly, we have the highly anticipated new R.F. Kuang, Catabasis. I've also, of course, seen it pronounced Catabasis, and eventually I will learn what it actually is, but this is following two academic rivals who follow their mentor to hell for a reference. Seemingly Dante's Inferno for magical Cambridge students. I'm of course as excited as anyone for a new R.F. Kuang, and I honestly haven't really been following a lot of the early reviews of this because I know I'm going to read it and we will see what we get. I don't know that this one needs much more of an introduction, but we'll see if I regret that I haven't read any part of the Divine Comedy since shortly after college. Another highly anticipated release for me personally, and something I already have pre-ordered, as well as a ticket to a book tour that was announced after I pre-ordered, and I pre-ordered with Barnes & Noble originally, I'm not going to lie, because this is a historical romance, and that historical romance is The Gilded Heiress by Joanna Shoup. However, then I got this ticket to this book tour, which we'll talk about in a second more, but I was like, oh, I can take my extra copy to the book event and get it signed for a friend. However, after the most recent pre-orders I had arrive from Barnes & Noble, I don't think it will be here in time. However, this is the newest Gilded Age historical romance from one of my favorite historical romance authors, Joanna Shoup. This is a reimagining of the cartoon movie of Anastasia, combined with, based on the blurb, some hints of the Lindbergh baby in relation to kind of the conceit of everything. Of course, the Lindbergh baby was not the Gilded Age. However, it follows a baby, a child who was stolen from a preeminent Gilded Age family. And we follow our protagonist, Josie, who was raised in an orphanage and wants or dreams of becoming a singer and sings on the street. And it's while she's singing on the street that Leo stumbles upon her. And Leo immediately kind of clocks the resemblance between Josie and the Pendleton family and the missing Pendleton baby. And Leo is a little bit of a swindler, but he recognizes a prime opportunity to get back at the Pendletons. And it is because of the Pendletons that his family lost everything. And so he recruits Josie, though of course I don't know, based on the blurb and my familiarity with the original cartoon movie, how much Josie is really in on it being a swindle. However, he enlists her, and together they find themselves in the kind of preeminent circles of Knickerbocker society. It's also notable because while Joanna Shoup has long been basically an auto-buy author for me, this is the first time Avon is sending her out on tour, to my knowledge, and if it is Avon that is behind the tour, which gives them some points in my book. It's an interesting move, and a move I'm keeping my eye on, especially as they are losing a lot of points next year, where Sarah MacLean has basically confirmed that they are ending mass market releases of their titles, and the kind of backing behind historical romance has been, I would argue, somewhat lackluster, but that is obviously, as we discussed last fall, a larger conversation and a developing and ongoing conversation. But it's an interesting sign for me, or an exciting sign for me, that they are going on tour in any capacity for this title. And I will also be interested to see where it fits within Joanna Shupe's larger body of work. Then next we have The Good Vampire's Guide to Blood and Boyfriends by Jamie D'Amato, which is described as Heartstopper meets Buffy, but it is following a college sophomore who was recently turned into a vampire and is attempting to adjust to his new life and keep his secret when he is stumbled upon by the campus librarian as he is drinking from a stolen blood bag. So like with some rom-com, this feels like it's going to be another supernatural, paranormal kind of rom-com, and I'm very excited to see what we get with this one. Next we have another historical romance. It's actually a pretty popular release day for historical romances, but we have Claiming the Princess by Cheris Michaels. This is the third in the Hidden Royal series. I haven't read any of this series, but I'm really intrigued by the description for this one, which is following a young woman who did not know she was a royal and a captain and war hero in an arranged marriage. Next we have If You're Seeing This, It's Meant For You by Lee Stein, which is a contemporary gothic thriller, and it's following a woman who has been enlisted to help turn this kind of crumbling mansion into the next big hype house, influencer house. Only a well-known tarot reader online has gone missing in the house, and the protagonist and another influencer are trying to get to the bottom of what is going on. One, we know I love a gothic, but two, I'm very interested in the social commentary that this is going to have, similar to kind of Moderation at the beginning of the month, but different, obviously, but something that is engaging in social commentary about online spaces, I think is very interesting and pertinent to the modern moment, and I feel like we're finally starting to see authors diving more readily into that realm, and influencer realm specifically, which I feel like has been a little more popular the last couple of years, but for how present and prevalent influencers are, especially for young people, I think it's interesting. And I'm also interested in the kind of play both in the title and the idea of a tarot reader, because if you're like me, if you are scrolling along TikTok and you start seeing kind of tarot reading videos, which is not something I engage with, I do start to question what maybe is going on in my life that I don't know about at any given point if those start showing up. Like, is there something in my mental health that I'm not clocking in how I've been reacting to other videos that those start showing up? But I also think it's an interesting angle and exploration of kind of magical thinking and the return of magical thinking to online spaces, especially with the rise of TikTok. So yeah, I'm very interested to see what exactly this book is going to be and what it's going to have to say. Next, continuing along with our historical romance, listen, I could have bunched them all together, but one, I didn't, and two, this way you never know what's coming next. We have A Waltz on the Wild Side by Erica Ridley, which is the third, not the third, it is the last in the Wild Winchesters series. I don't know that that is reading, so I'm gonna put it down, but I do have an arc that I have started on my Kobo. I'm only like 12% in, which was 1 hour of walking on the treadmill at the gym, because in July I rejoined the gym in order to be able to walk and read in climate control. I finally just read Tommy's story in the Wild Winchesters last month, and I will admit that I am skipping ahead to Jacob's story here, but it is following Jacob, who is the last Winchester according to the series. He is the animal Winchester and also a poet, and his love interest, though they have not yet met in what I've read so far of the book, is a reporter slash playwright. So this will be the second playwright I've read in a historical romance in as many months, which is interesting. I don't know that I've encountered that many playwrights, especially female playwrights, in my historical romance prior to having a couple very close together. But she has a cousin who is obsessed with the Winchesters, and they live together, but she is much more skeptical of the Winchesters and the privilege she thinks that they represent, and so there is a kind of animosity there, but her cousin is at the level of kind of a fan of them that he is basically cosplaying the Winchesters with another group, and he has just disappeared, which is seemingly going to put her in contact with the Winchesters or seeking the Winchesters out in effort to find him. So very excited to see where exactly this is going to go. Another historical romance, and one that I have pre-ordered, is Gabriella and His Grace by Liana de la Rosa, which is the third in the Luna Sisters series. I really enjoyed Isabel and the Rogue last year. I thought it kind of settled into its voice a lot. Anna Maria and the Fox I enjoyed, and I thought it had a lot of really good ideas, but I found the pacing off for me in a lot of ways, and that was kind of frustrating because of how good the ideas were. And also I remember it like framed itself around a marriage of convenience that was structurally much later in the book and much more inconsequential than it led itself to believe. And I thought Isabel and the Rogue was a lot smoother in terms of that pacing. I really enjoyed the kind of spying elements of the book and had a whole lot of fun. And so I'm very excited for Gabriella's book, especially as her and the Duke have been kind of circling each other for 2 books. We love a good lead up. I love the fact that he has glasses on the cover of this book and in the artwork that has been commissioned for pre-order incentives from specific bookstores. So very excited and interested in that. It also seems like we're going to get away from London at the beginning of this book, and so I'm very interested in exploring new settings and locales here. I haven't read a whole lot about this because I just know that I'm going to read it, and so I'm very excited to see what exactly the dynamic is going to be between these two. I think it's going to involve some kind of scandal potentially, so we will see. Next we have a fantasy academic rivals to lovers romance, The Entanglement of Rival Wizards by Sarah Rosh, which is described as Allie Hazelwood meets Dungeons and Dragons. In it, we are following human Sebastian and half-elf Elethior, who are forced to share a lab and grant money. This looks right up my alley and seems to have elements of a cozier fantasy in terms of the kind of world building, but also some of those high academic stakes. Next we have a historical fiction, The Secret Book Society by Madeline Martin, and it's set in 1895 in Victorian London and follows a forbidden book club and the women it brings together. And then finally for the month, and another book I have on pre-order, we have The Sea Witch by Eva Lee, which is a historical romantasy. And in the vein of India Holton, which I still need to read her newer books, but I am interested in the kind of overlap between historical romance and romantasy and the opportunities that lie in that realm, because I do think that there are a lot of opportunities there that this seems to be exploring, and that kind of blending of magic and history. And this is following a condemned witch who uses her magical ability to flee puritanical New England and become the captain of a pirate ship. And as the British Navy is in hot pursuit, naval navigator Ben finds himself kidnapped by said pirates. So we've got a lot here. One, we have a very different historical setting for Eva Lee, who I am more familiar with her more Regency era romances or Victorian. Does she have any Victorian romances? Either way, her more kind of familiar British society romances. So I'm already kind of perking up at the idea of starting in puritanical New England and starting with the witch hunts, and then we move in to pirates, which I feel like the last pirate romance I read, was it Beverly Jenkins? It's been a second. There is, of course, a whole subgenre of pirate historicals. I just haven't picked one up for a hot second, so that's exciting in and of itself. And then we have a woman pirate queen, kind of a la Amina El-Sarafi or Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. Both books I really enjoyed, and so definitely something I am very interested in. And I'm interested to see this new avenue from Eva Lee, who is one of my favorite historical authors, and this still feels rooted in that history enough while offering the more kind of fantasy romance elements as well, and potentially offering a kind of bridge to more modern readers who maybe haven't dabbled in historical romance. So I don't know, I'm obviously paying very close attention to the genre, but this still feels rooted in that historical romance to me. So I'm very excited to just have the magic sprinkled on top of that, as well as someone who also loves some fantasy. And with that, that is August. I don't know why I felt I was being conservative this month in my book selection and thought that we would speed through this a little quicker like we did last month, and I guess we'll see at the end how long this ends ends up being. And there are obviously a lot of very exciting titles coming out in August. So let me know what you're excited about below, whether we talked about it already or not. Thank you, as always, for being interested in what I'm excited for and what I have to say. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.